Hey guys, this is Fallout86 for Raise Your Edge, and in this video we'll talk about c-betting out of position as the preferred raiser. And our first point is really important because you will be checking a lot when you're out of position as a preferred raiser, and that's totally fine. Just get used to it because this will be our standard play fairly often. And this is our general approach, that we want to play more passively overall out of position, especially in single raise pots. In split pots we have a slightly different approach. Yeah, we definitely try to keep the pots small when we're out of position usually, because the problem is when you're always betting the flop, you really bloat the pot with all the marginal hands for turn and river, and this constantly, and obviously you cannot have all the time a great hand. So yeah, you're playing huge pots with marginal hands, and this is not a good idea. Another problem is that we allow our opponents to play big pots with us when they're in position, and that's happening way too often, so they win way more than they should with their strong hands and with their middling type hands. And another huge point is we protect our checking range. Because when you don't protect your checking range, that you have a check call and check raise range on the flop on nearly any board texture, then your opponent can just go ahead and bet, right? If you're check folding 80-90% and you're only check calling sometimes with ace king high or second pair, you're probably overfolding a ton. And that's why it is important out of position to have a good checking range. When we are out of position as the preferred raiser, we usually have two options when it comes to strategy. We can either bet polarized on the flop or depolarized, so merged range. Both options are fine. They obviously depend on our raising range and the calling range from our opponent. Usually want to stick more often to the polarized betting range because it's just way more profitable in most of the situations. But it will be easier for you when I explain them. So when we play with a polarized betting range, we usually bet our strong value hands and our good bluffs that have value equity. And this means we are betting top pair, top kicker, and better hands, or top pair, good kicker, and all the better hands. So the plus is always for all the better hands. So when we have two pair sets and so on, we're always betting most of the time. If we have flush draws, we are betting, and if we have open-ended straight draws, we are also betting. And yes, sometimes when we have the nut gut shot plus one overcard and the backdoor flush draws, sure, that's also fine to bluff, right? But you get the point. When we have a middling type hand or a very weak bluff, then we should check. So when we just have top pair with a middling type kicker or with a weak kicker, when we have just a weak gut shot, we have ace high and so on, then we should check. And when we play with a polarized betting range, we usually use bigger sizings, so half pot up to full pot, depending on our betting range. So how many hands we bet, how many hands we check call. When we play with a depolarized betting range, it's completely different. We bet most of the time, often 100% of our preflop raising range. So we bet all the value hands and all the bluffs. Of course, when we use this strategy, we cannot bet fairly large. Usually want to stick to fairly small bet sizing. So 1/4, 1/3, sometimes half pot, but usually smaller sizings, because otherwise we just invest way too much money with our weak hands, and with our value bets we are not getting called often enough when we bet bigger. Okay, let's continue with the main factor. So how should we decide if we should bet a hand or check a hand? And most important, what are realistic ranges from our opponents? So we start with the questions: what are preflop tendencies of the callers? And yeah, you should just try to estimate the range from your opponents. So yeah, he limp called, right? In which position is he? Does he limp call with like 20%, 30%, 30%. What do you think? What have you seen so far? Which hands did you see at showdown? This is really important when you try to estimate the range of your opponents. And of course, sometimes we're a bit off, but it's important if you give your opponent 60-70% range or 20-30% range, right? Because we should play definitely different against those ranges. And you should definitely practice how these pre-flop calling or raising ranges interact with the different board textures. And here I highly recommend using Acrolab or Flopzilla just to have an idea how many good hands he has on different board textures. So how many top pairs, how many two pairs, how many sets, and how much auto profit do we have auto profit at all on this board texture? Is he calling a ton? Is he folding a ton? And this is not easy to learn. You just have to do the hard work. You just need to calculate and see how the ranges interact with the different board textures. And there's no easier way. Just use Flopzilla or Acrolab and go through different board textures with different ranges, and then you're getting better really, really fast. In general, when we play against wider ranges, we can get thinner value and we have more full equity with bluffs. So we can just bet a wider range, usually with a very small sizing. So when you think about a situation that's fairly similar, so you have an opponent on the button, for example, you ISO him in the small blind, and he limp calls with nearly every single hand, right? So then you get a flop, you get a dry board texture. Doesn't matter how it looks like, he will overfold on most board textures, and he definitely will continue with a ton of very weak hands. And this means we have auto profit, right? Our bluffs benefit a lot on nearly any board texture, and we can also go for very thin value because he's never folding anything what connects somewhat with the board. So here you have the perfect example when it makes sense to bet a wider range. It's completely different when we play against a tight range because we have less value and less full equity with our bluffs. So we should bet a stronger range with a larger sizing. And here as an example, we can just say, okay, we ISO raise against a very tight player that limped an under gun. And he's probably not folding enough if we bet with our whole range on nearly any board texture, right? Because his limp calling range is way too strong for that. So in this situation, we should go for a bigger sizing with a really polarized range. Okay, let's continue with our next question, and I cannot tell you how important this question is. You should always ask yourself this question on the flop, always, because it's so mandatory. And the question is, how many streets of value do I have? Do you have 1 street, 2 street, or 3 streets? So can you just bet the flop, flop turn, right, or turn river, or flop turn and river? Usually if you only have 1 or max 2 streets, we can start checking more often, right? Because we don't need to get our value on the flop, because when you have 1 street, if you get your 1 street on the flop, you always have to check full turn. Well, that's probably not ideal, right? So check calling sounds like a better idea fairly often, and so on, right? When we have max 2 streets, we should probably check flop or turn. And when you have 3 clear streets of value, we should almost always bet the flop just to start building a pot, because otherwise, really hard when he checks to build a huge pot. So when you have a fairly strong hand like a set, a straight, 2 pair, strong overpairs, and so on, just bet flop. Really, really simple. When you have 3 streets, you have to bet flop most of the time. And to have an idea how many streets we have, we can just ask the next questions. Okay, your first question should always be how many opponents are in the pot. And when we play against multiple opponents, we should always stick to a polarized range. Because we are playing against a combined range and we just have not enough full equity with our weak bluffs. Because we are not playing only against one range, we are playing against multiple ranges. And it's really hard to go for streets of value without a very strong hand. Makes sense, right? Because yeah, when there's multiple people in the pot, it's much more likely that someone has a strong hand. And that's the reason why we should try to keep the pot really small out of position with weak and middling type hands. When we are heads up, it's a different story. As I explained earlier, when we play against a wide range, we can bet more depolarized. So we can bet for immediate full equity, for equity protection, and so on. But still, you can definitely establish a checking range. So you can check some middling type hands like pocket nines on queen 7 deuce, for an example. If you feel the check against this particular player is just more profitable, if you have no idea or you play against an unknown, it's probably more profitable to bet a large range and then yeah, also bet pocket nines on queen 7 deuce. Okay, another example, we are in the cutoff and a loose passive button called, so flop is king h3 rainbow, and on this board texture king h3 rainbow we can just go ahead and bet our entire range with 35% pot size. And in this situation we bet all the good 8x or better hands for value, so even with a weak 8, right? And when we have a weak value hand, we just bet for protection and thin value, so a hand like a3 suited or pocket sixes. Okay, the next main question is, how is the board texture? And as a general rule, the wetter the board, the more polarized we should bet. So for an example, when we have king queen on queen jack 9 with a flush draw and it's four-handed, sure, it's okay to check the flop, cause a lot of stronger hands are possible and it's really hard to get 3 streets from worse on queen jack 9, right? Cause yeah, there are a ton of queen 9, king 10, 10 8, pocket 9 sometimes, all those strong hands. And even if your opponent has a worse hand like queen 8, yeah, probably not that easy to get 3 streets from this queen. And again, you don't want to build a huge pot against all the better hands. And again, you want to protect your checking range. If you bet king queen and bet all the other strong hands, you're probably never check calling often enough. You're definitely overfolding. But if we change the board texture to queen 3-8 rainbow with king queen and we're also four-handed, sure, you can value bet this board texture, no problem. But of course, this is probably the bottom of our value betting range, because we still need a check call range, right? So yeah, we can definitely go ahead and bet this hand most of the time on a rainbow board texture, but not when it's super connected and super draw heavy. Okay, the next main question is, against which player type am I playing? When you play against a really competent or tight player, we should check more often out of position. So we should bet more polarized against him. Because against those players, it's important to protect our checking range. So we are not overfolding on the flop if we check. We have enough strong and middling type hands in our check calling range, and we also have a check raise range. And this is important because yeah, you need to protect your range for later streets versus aggression. Because yeah, some opponents are not only betting once, right? They're not only betting flop, they're sometimes betting multiple streets. So yeah, you should definitely have some strong hands in your checking range. And of course, as I mentioned, we should definitely include some very strong hands and bluffs in our check raise range, but we'll talk more about that in the next slide. And you can also have a delayed c-bet range for value and as a bluff on later streets against competent players or tight players. When we play against a loose passive player, we should bet more depolarized, so with a larger betting range and a smaller sizing, because against those player types we can go for thin value and we can profitably bluff with a very wide betting range, because they are overfolding on so many board textures, because their range is just too wide. Super often they have nothing with nothing, and they have to let it go. Even when they call all the gut shots, all the ace highs, all the pairs and so on, they are still overfolding on a ton of board textures, given our small sizing. And even when they float, it goes to showdown super often against a very weak hand. So for an example, when a passive player floats with a gut shot or with a straight draw or the flush draw, they're not always betting those hands. Sometimes it goes check turn, check river, and you win with king high, queen high, or whatever. And when we have a board texture where we don't want to bet that wide, we don't need to protect our checking range that much, because this player type will not punish our imbalance. This means they're usually just playing their hand. So if we check, they have nothing, they're usually checking also. And this means, yeah, we don't need to protect our checking range so much, because they will never exploit that. Yeah, let's move on to the next player type. How should we play against a very aggressive or maniac? And against those players, we should check some really strong hands for sure. Cause yeah, give them some room. Let them hang themselves. Cause when you check, they really see this as a green light to barrel, sometimes to barrel off, right? Sometimes you can check flop and then just bet flop, bet turn, bet river with absolutely nothing. And of course, if you bet too light against them, they're just folding, right? If they have nothing, they're usually not going crazy, they're just folding. So give them some room to hang themselves and to overbluff on multiple streets. What's also important is when your opponent is very sticky or spewy. So for an example, you know if he has top pair, he is never going to fold. Sure, just go ahead, bet all your strong hands for value as a standard. So yeah, if you have 3 streets, no checking allowed, just bet flop, bet turn, bet river, that's it, get max value. And the last question you can ask yourself is, do I need equity protection? And when you think about that, definitely think about which hands benefit from equity protection. And yeah, usually those are hands that benefit, that yeah, people fold their 6-outers. So you should only do that when you have enough fold equity. Otherwise, you can just bet all the board textures with very weak hands, and this is not our strategy. And please never bet hands that are way too strong for that. So yeah, when you have top pair, no kicker, or second pair, those are usually not the hands that need equity protection. Because yeah, we are still playing a range, right? And we are trying to play our whole range as good as we can. And yeah, usually when we bet for equity protection, we bet our low pairs, usually yeah, below 8 or 9, depending on the board texture. So here we have a good example with second pair. So yeah, second pair can sometimes be a bluff, especially on those low board textures. So ace-4 suited or ace-deuce suited on yeah 10-4 deuce, 3-way against wide ranges. Cause super often we have the best hand, but it's really hard to go with this hand to showdown if we check. And we have only 1 street of value. If we improve to trips or 2 pairs, sure, we have 3 streets. But yeah, when the turn is a blank, we only have 1 street. And here we highly benefit from our equity protection bet. So we bet because we have equity, we have super often the best hand, and we have enough fold equity on this yeah, super dry board texture with wide ranges. And even if our opponent is bluffing on later streets, it's really hard to bluff catch because our own hand is so weak, and on later streets our opponents can have yeah, a ton of stronger hands. So it's super hard to showdown, to go to showdown, and that's why it's more profitable to equity protection bet in those situations. Okay, let's talk about a different example. So next example, we have pocket sevens on queen 5-4 and we are 5-way. Here it's super obvious that we have also max one street of value, but when we are five-handed, it's not realistic that we have enough fold equity, because the more players are in the hand, the more likely it is that someone has something and is not going to fold. And this means we have not enough fold equity, and we should just give up and check fold, usually five-handed. And now let's recap the question that we should ask ourselves before we check or bet out of position as a preferred raiser. And the first question is always, what's the estimated range from our opponents? The next question is, how many streets of value do we have? 1, 2, or 3 streets. Against how many opponents do I play? 1, 2, 3, 10. Next question is a skill level from our opponents. Is my opponent a tight player, a very loose player, a passive player, a very good player, and so on. Next question is, what is the board texture? Is the board texture very draw heavy or very dry? And the last question is, do I have enough fold equity to protection bet my low pair? Okay, let's continue to our next important topic, check raising as the preferred raiser. And we should definitely mix this into our game at some frequency, not as a standard play always, but a check raise range is super effective and important. And especially against aggressive, spewy, or call happy players, you can get big immediate value when you check raise with a strong hand. And of course, you also deny free equity for turn and river, because when you're only check calling, you're very easy to play against, because then your opponent is betting everything that has somewhat equity, right? And he's basically realizing his equity always for free. And this is definitely not our idea. This is not how we want to play poker. And we definitely want to punish white stabbers. So when someone bets way too often, you can just punish him with a loose check raise, because you create a ton of fold equity against his bet, because he's betting way too wide. And the next important point is that it is hard to play against us when we have a huge check raise range, or we have a check raise range at all, because players will realize that and then start to check back the flop more often. And this means they allow us more often to realize our equity basically for free with middling type hands. And this is of course awesome, because when you're hard to play against, people don't want to get check raised. That's the reason why they start to check their own hands way more often. We should talk about hand strength now that you have an idea with which hand you can do what and why. So in general, we should use very strong value hands, our strongest draws, sometimes weak draws, strong backdoor draws, or ace high draws. So for example, ace high flush draws for our check raise range. When we have a middling value hand or middling type draw, we usually just bet or check call. We usually don't want to check raise those hands, because we always get into trouble. So for an example here, we have top pair, middling type kicker, or we have a weak flush draw multi-way. Because when you check raise, for example, with a weak top pair, there's so many better hands, and you get called, of course, by all the better hands. So you're building a huge pot out of position with a very weak hand, and you're super often just crushed by the calling range. The other situation, you check raise a very weak flush draw, also not the perfect situation, because all the better flush draws are obviously all the time calling. So you're building a huge pot with a very weak flush draw, and you're forced to get it in when you improve. And of course, most of the time when you improve, you're not winning, right? You are underdog against all the better flushes, and that's why you want to check raise with a way more polarized range, as we see above. Because we don't mind getting an in on the flop with a very strong value hand, because we beat most value hands from our opponent, and with the best draws also. We beat all the worst draws, and even against a very strong hand, we have to call it off. So when we have a nut flush draw plus overcuts, for an example, this is a really strong draw. When we have a weaker draw, so for an example, we have a gut shot or two overcuts with a vector flush draw or bottom pair, we don't mind check raise folding. That's never a problem. Because if our opponent goes all in, well, no problem, we can fold. It was just our bluffing range that we fold against his jam. We still have our value range, so no problem. But of course, it will not happen that often that your opponent gets all the money in on the flop. It's way more likely that he folds or calls the flop. And if he is just calling flop, we can barrel the turn if we improve our equity. For an example, with our backdoor flush draw, we pick up the flush draw or an open-ended straight draw, right? Of course, when the turn is a brick, so we don't improve our equity on the turn, it's super important that we are usually just giving up after we check raise. Okay, let's continue how we should play against the different player types. So when the pot is a multi-way or the board is very wet, we use mainly value hands for check raise. Because we just have less fold equity, and it's really likely that someone has a somewhat decent hand. When we play against a really aggressive better, we just try to access tendencies. So how often are they stepping in position when checked to? Do they bet all the time? Do they check sometimes? And the more often they bet fold, the more bluffs we can use, right? So for an example, when we heads up on queen 4-4 against a very wide aggressive floater and stabber, instead of betting with most of our hands with bluffs, you can just check raise super wide with bluffs. Again, when we have overcards like king high, backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, it's just way more profitable. Just make sure you have enough turn cards that you can continue bluffing. So please don't check raise 2-3 offsuit on queen 4-4. I hope you get the point, right? We always want to have some backdoor equity that we can make the best hand. Okay, how should we play against other regulars? I would say many regulars will step super wide on the flop when they're in position, and this is correct because most ranges are not protected, so most players are not check calling and check raising enough. Most players are still overfolding because they bet way too wide out of position, and we can exploit a lot of those regulars by check raising super wide or wider than usual with bluffs. And this is definitely an underbluffed line at the live felt, and that's the reason why most regs will give you credit and they fold way more than they should. That's definitely a huge plus, but we play against regulars, so make sure to always mix in some good hands as well. So we should not go ahead and only check raise as a bluff. We should also check raise some strong hands. When we play against a tight or loose passive player, we should almost always raise with strong value hands. I would say we can sometimes use very high equity draws, but usually that's it. Because we just have not enough fold equity against them. Because when they're tight, they're not betting super loose on the flop. They have enough short-term value to check down. And a loose passive player, again, he's loose, but he's passive, so he's not betting middling type hands on the flop. He's usually betting fairly strong hands on the flop, and if he bets those hands, he's usually not there to fold. He's going to continue with all his bets super often. So usually we just bet our good value hands because they are too passive. Of course, it depends a bit on the player. in particular and on the board texture. So in some situations, sure, you can check raise some really strong hands on some board textures, but when we think overall about all the situations combined, we definitely prefer value betting instead of check raising with most strong hands and draws, because they are way too passive and they don't bet often enough. Okay, now we should talk what we do when we face a raise out of position. And let's talk first about dry board textures. So when we play against aggressive players, we can all the time, and we should all the time, call with our very strong value hands and just let them hang themselves. So please do never 3-bet fold the flop or something like this. Just call with your stronger hands. Because the problem by 3-betting flop is that you make villain's range super small. And a large problem is also that when we 3-bet the flop, our opponent is just going to fold all his bluffs. And we definitely want to keep all his bluffs in his range. So yeah, he should definitely be able to raise flop, bet turn, bet river as a bluff. And that's why it is important not to 3-bet the flop with our stronger hands. Always play call when the flop is fairly dry. And another advantage on those dry board textures is that it's really never a problem to give a free card, because we can still call down on most turn and river cards. And we earn so much money from his bluffs that yeah, it's really never, or it should never be a problem to give 1 or 2 free cards against a very aggressive opponent. Of course, against a tight player, it's a different story in general, because most tight players don't raise a lot of air on the flop. So please proceed very cautiously, and you should also make some big folds right away. So when you have only a second pair type hand or a top pair weak kicker type hand, and you know your opponent is usually never going to bluff raise this flop, then please go ahead and just fold on the flop. And also other hands you should fold on later streets when he still bets large turn, bets large river. We always want to fold some value hands on every street. And most very tight live players also have a very small bluffing range. Sometimes they have just no bluffing range. Sometimes their check raise or raising range is just 2 pairs and sets. And of course, against this range, you can basically fold anything. But when you don't know the opponent, I would not do that. Then sure, we should call all our stronger top pair hands and so on. But when you really know your opponent, you played a ton with him, then no problem of overfolding on the flop. And when we have a very strong value hand, like a set or something like this, and we know our opponent has basically no bluffing range, then sure, we can always put in the 3-bet on the flop, especially when we play deeper. Because the problem is that it's always really hard to get stacks in, and a lot of those players are afraid of anything. So even when it's only the backdoor straight draw or the backdoor flush draw that comes in on the river, people don't want to play for stacks anymore. And also once they raise the flop with a value hand, they are just never folding to the 3-bet, and also usually on later streets. So this is definitely super profitable. Same situation, but this time we face a raise on a wet board, and of course on a wet board it's a different story. Again, against aggressive players in general, I think with our medium good value hands we can just call down when the board run out is pretty good for us to catch their bluffs. Again, when we go ahead and 3-bet, we're not getting it in against a very good range, because yeah, they will fold their bluffs. And yeah, against the shoving range we probably do not have the needed equity, and therefore calling down is usually way more profitable and should be our standard play. But when we have a very good value hand, we want to change this strategy, because we definitely want to deny a lot of equity and free cards. And also we are missing out on a lot of value, because villain is getting it in on the flop with a lot of his draws and also with weaker value hands. And that's why when you have a top range hand, please get it in on the flop when you think you're getting called by a ton of worse hands. You also have the problem that you don't want to see a ton of turn cards. And that's why it's way more profitable to get it in on the flop, because on the turn, when the flush gets there or the straight gets there, the other player's also scared. And sure, now we also can't get it in for stacks, and that's why 3-betting flop is just way more profitable overall with our top range. Against tight players, our strategy is nearly the same as before. So again, please overfold against those players on the flop, because they don't have too many draws usually. Because when they have a straight draw or a flush draw or a gut shot, most of the time they are just calling with those hands. And yeah, that's why their raising range is so much stronger. And as you can see, against those tight players, we never get into any problems. And that's why we definitely want to have a bluff raising range all the time, because otherwise your opponents just fold all the time and we can't make any money. And it's so easy to play against you, so you never want to be this very tight player that only raises for value on the flop. Alright, that's it for this video. I hope you got a good understanding now how we should play out of position as the pre-flop raiser. As I mentioned, there will also be a hand example video that you can see this theory in action. So I hope I'll also see you in my next video, and this was Fallout 86 for RaiseYourEdge.com. Bye bye.